Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to today's webinar, Biometric Governments in Practice. My name is Peter O'Neill, and I am the president of FindBiometrics and Mobile ID World. And what a time for our industry. Biometrics and identity play an important role in so many innovative areas like IoT, robotics, connected living, autonomous vehicles, not to mention government, physical access, payments, fintech, and healthcare. Biometrics are hot. And the two big news events this month, the Equifax breach and the Apple 3D facial launch, were certainly the buzz at the FedID government show in Washington 2 weeks ago. It is generally felt that the Apple facial launch will be as important to our industry as their Touch ID launch was 3 years ago. And as we learned yesterday, the Equifax breach cost CEO Richard Smith his job, albeit with a potential $90 million pay package according to Fortune. Something is wrong with this picture. And in 3 weeks, we will be in Las Vegas at the Money 2020 conference. Well, I'll be moderating the Biometric Payments panel, my 4th year doing so. This is the largest and most important conference in the super hot fintech market. This is all part of our mission at FindBiometrics to bring biometrics to financial services. I hope to meet some of our attendees there. If you're planning on going, please reach out. I'd be happy to grab a coffee. With so much going on, be sure to stay on top of all the breaking news by visiting FindBiometrics and our sister site, Mobile ID World. Now in our 16th year, we cover the market like no one else with in-depth articles, insights, the largest yearly review of our industry, which is coming right up, featured theme months, newsletters, interviews with leaders in this space, international speaking engagements, and of course, our now famous webinar series. And this month, all month long, we have been focusing on biometric governments in practice. So we have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in. Please note, to ask a question, just type it into your dialog box in the Go-To control panel on the right side of your screens. And please do this at any time. Don't wait until the end, as this will give us an opportunity to manage your questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible at the end, and there'll be quite a few given the number of attendees today. This webinar will last about 40 minutes in total and will be recorded and available at findbiometrics.com. I would now like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors for their continuing support, NEC and Crossmatch, and a special thanks to Acuity Market Intelligence. And to start off our discussions today, I am so pleased that Maxine is providing our industry overview. Max is the principal of Acuity Market Intelligence and is the top analyst in our industry. I have known Max well for about the last 15 years, and she has accurately predicted every step of this biometric evolution we are seeing right now. Max will be providing us with her latest thinking. I am so pleased to introduce the mighty Maxine Most. Take it away, Max.
Thank you, Peter, and good day to everyone. Today, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview, sort of some real high-level thinking, because I think we have a great panel here to get in some deep discussion. And then I'll give you some of the latest data that Acuity has on relevant to these markets. For those of you that don't know, Acuity is a very data-driven analyst firm. So if you're feeling somehow neglected because I haven't called up your company to interview you to gather data for the reports, we don't do our reports that way. We actually count things that we can independently verify, as opposed to just trying to gather information directly from the vendors. So I hope that if we haven't connected yet, you'll reach out. I'd love to, as Peter said, I'll be at Money 2020 as well. Love to connect with people in the industry, particularly folks I haven't seen for a long time, or those of you that I don't know yet. So let's just dig into this a little bit, and then we'll get to the panel. So what I want to talk about in general is a couple of really kind of big mega identity trends that's impacting the marketplace right now. And the first of those, and you'll see this in the data I'm going to present, is really the maturation of solutions. We are on second and third generation solutions in e-passports, in national ID, in automated border control, in physical and logical access. In fact, in some cases, we're moving on to fourth generation. And we're seeing that across the board. So the market today is not the market that we were looking at 5 or 10 years ago. It's radically different. We've proven our capabilities in terms of an industry. We are delivering solutions. We are identifying and verifying tens of millions of people on a daily basis. So I think that really is a fundamental shift in the way everyone is thinking about how we're going to use biometrics going forward in the government space. The second mega trend is really getting to a place where we're now on the ID front, really looking at multifunctional integration. In the past, we've talked about IDs that were going to do more than one thing, but now we're seeing them in real life. We're seeing, you know, national ID programs, driver's license, health ID, social services, all being integrated into single card programs and also into purely digital identity programs. So that, again, is something that, you know, 8 years ago, I was talking about in terms of what the future would look like. And really, in that respect, the future has arrived. And now we're trying to sort out, how do you do that well? What are the best practices? You know, which regions and which countries have really done an effective job at integrating identity across a range of applications and services. The other thing, which is obviously very top of mind now, is the evolving regulatory and compliance environment, the requirements that are coming out. We're seeing this across the board, whether it's the U.S. Department of Defense requiring multi-factor authentication, or across the board in Europe now. Privacy obviously is a huge issue, and I've been talking about this for some time in terms of, you know, how organizations that monetize data are going to be, what those industries are going to look like going forward. And I think, you know, given the Equifax debacle, it's sort of fuel for the fire on that one. And then finally, I think another huge trend, which is impacting globally, is really looking at integrated border automation. And again, we're talking about second and third generations of e-gates, of automated passport control kiosks, of integrating now biometrics into the process of manual border control. So to me, this is really, the marketplace is very, very different than it was, as I said, 5 or 10 years ago, where I think the industry was in the place of really trying to prove ourselves. And I think now it's not a question of proving ourselves, it's a question of taking all of this technology to the next level and to really talking about issues around privacy, around data protection, around, you know, how do you manage these large scale systems in a way that really provide a lot of value to governments and to citizens while we're not feeling threatened by the technology. So the other side of this coin then is looking at what's disrupting the market and what's going to be really driving where this market is going in the future. And obviously the mobilization of biometrics across the board is unlike anything we've ever seen in the industry. And the scale of opportunity that's been created by a global platform of personal mobile devices, which is now, my Acuity's projections are by the end of this year, we'll have 1.9 billion of these devices, essentially smartphones that are integrated, have integrated biometrics. Now, not all of these are highly secure. Some of the sensors are a little sketchy. There's a lot of cheap phones out there that are doing some really unfortunate things like storing bitmap data. But the notion that biometrics are here to stay, the notion that biometrics are an integral part of our life as consumers and as citizenry is just the de facto reality. And the question is, how are governments as well as commercial entities gonna respond to this? You know, how do we take this on as an integrated part of the way we do business on a daily basis? So sort of complementary to that is a ton of commercial off-the-shelf solutions, system solutions, hardware solutions. You know, the idea of pure specialization in solving government problems just is not the future for biometrics. The question is, how do we integrate commercial off-the-shelf products and services in a way that can meet the requirements of various governments across the board? And whether that's, you know, this is how do we integrate our digital credentials into our mobile devices, or how do we use our mobile device biometrics to navigate, for example, through an airport? All of these are questions that this industry is going to have to look at and understand and answer in the next 3 to 5 years and beyond. As the digitalization of credentials, we're just starting to see this, but in a decade, this is going to be mainstream. And this is even reflected in some of the numbers that I'll be presenting to you, because I think what we're sitting at in the next 3 to 5 years is, to me, is the peak of biometrically enabled physical credentials. So that, to me, is going to peak out. And over the next decade, the question is, how do we create a truly digital platform for the physical credentials and for verifying identity across, again, a range of government services and applications, as well as in the commercial sector? And what's the interaction between those two? How do those live together? And then finally, this notion of do-nothing biometrics, which is something I've been talking about for a long time. So it makes me happy when people like Apple make my life easier. The notion that we're getting to looking at facial recognition and iris recognition, we're looking at technology that is going to recognize us without us having to do anything. And I've always sort of framed this as, I'm going to pick up my mobile phone and it's going to recognize me. And whether it's my voice or my pulse or my palm or whatever it is, that there's going to be this ease in which we are linking ourselves to devices. And then as we are conducting our business on a day-to-day basis, whether that means I'm being continuously authenticated as I'm sitting down at a computer where critical and secure information is being managed, whether I'm walking through an airport and I don't have to go through a lot of this rigmarole in terms of identifying myself, but in the process of moving through a space, I'm going to be identified. So I think these are the things that are really driving the future of the industry over the next, as I said, 3, 5, and ultimately 10 years. And a decade from now, we're going to be looking back at these disruptors in the same way that we were looking in the previous slide, as sort of, you know, how have these things been integrated into a mature market? So I think, to me, that's sort of the context for the discussion today. And as I said, Acuity is a very data-driven company, and so we provide data and analysis on things that we can count, that are measurable, independent of, not to dismiss the vendors in this industry that I think do a fantastic job, but my job is to try to actually assess the market independently and present information to you, not necessarily, you know, build my analysis on your internal projections. So hopefully, you know, a number of you are actually using my data to help with your internal projections, and I'm always happy to discuss, you know, how we work and our methodologies and how we gather the data. So I'm just going to throw a bunch of data at you now for the next couple of minutes on national IDs, on e-passports, and automated border control, and mobile, because this is where Acuity plays. So as I mentioned, you know, I think we're going to start to see peak sort of card volume over the next several years. And when we get into the 2020s, we're actually going to see that start to back off a little bit for 2 reasons. One is, I think there's going to be a move to digital credentials, and 2 is because all the major programs are being deployed. And, you know, like India is talking about deploying in 2018. The Philippines, which has been putting this off for years, is now talking about it again. I'll believe it when I see it. But, you know, basically, we've gotten to a point where almost everybody that's going to do this has done this. And so you see, you tend to see a burst of card production in the early years of programs. So what we're seeing here is sort of a flattening out of the market over the next couple of years. Go ahead, Peter. There we go. So just to let you know, these numbers, which I think is interesting. Oh, can you go back one, Peter? There's 2 kinds of programs that I include in the analysis that Acuity does for national EIDs. And one of those are the numbers you saw previously, which are the darker blue numbers here, which are the actual credentials that have chips in the card. But the other piece of it is there are quite a few programs that are using traditional cards without chips, but they're using biometric identifiers. So we break that out just so you have a sense of where the market is. So you can see there's another 80 to 100 million of cards issued every year where there's biometric identifiers used, though they're not using chips in those cards. Okay, we can go on now. And just as far as circulation numbers, we're talking about getting up to about 3.6 billion by 2021. And you have to realize, like, a huge percentage of these obviously are China. And then India, as I said, in 2018 is planning on issuing cards to go with their national identification program that they have in place, where they're doing finger, face, and iris. So we're expecting to see cards come out of that. Okay, so passports. This is, again, we're looking at the annual number of passports. You see, there's not a lot of growth here over the next 5 years, again, because we're sort of reaching the place where everybody who is going to have an e-passport has an e-passport. There's a few stragglers, but essentially we're looking at a run rate of about, getting up to about 130 million of those credentials a year, and that's obviously because every 5 to 10 years you have to get these things replaced. And again, when we talked about maturation, we're talking about second and third generation of e-passports right now. This gives you an idea of just circulation numbers, where we are percentage-wise of e-passports versus total passports in circulation. So we are really well on our way to total domination of e-passports, and just a few stragglers. And most of these countries are poorer countries that haven't invested in the infrastructure.
Max, I like this one because when you go back to 2015 and see that the numbers start to fall for traditional passports, and my gosh, that's quite a decrease and very rapidly changing. So
yeah, and we have these numbers tracked back to 2009. So when you look at that, you really see that fall off. But that's why I said this is mainstream technology. Just a few. You're talking about 40 million a year. You're talking about relatively small, poor countries that haven't adopted this technology. And honestly, at some point, the Western countries are just going to have to pay for them to do it, and they're just going to have to get it done, because everyone's going to have an e-passport. And again, primarily because the next level of this is how do you digitalize these? And so, then you're going to see that conversion from physical to digital. Now, this is the eGate installed base. Now, what's interesting about eGates is they've not really growing at the rate that I don't think anybody expected them to grow. What we're seeing is a lot of replacement. So this is installed base, but what we're seeing volume is replacement. Like at Hong Kong, I think, is on the 3rd generation of eGates, and they're in the midst of reinstalling 600 of these. We're seeing airports and countries that have invested in this technology upgrading. Probably Australia is the best example. I think they have 3rd generation eGates, and now they want to move towards a credential-less eGate system where you're just simply using a biometric to pass through. So what we're really seeing is the places that have invested in this infrastructure are updating it. We're not seeing every single airport everywhere adopting this technology. And my guess is that given where the industry is going now, we may see not as many eGates as really I think I expected, a lot of people expected, and moving more towards different types of automation that uses a single biometric to move through the space, and that perhaps we don't need the gate infrastructure the way we have it designed. So I think that I think my projection was that the total market capacity for this was something like 8,000, but we may never get there. We maybe get to 3, we may maybe get to 4, but I think we're going to see that level off as well as this technology shifts. And this just gives you an idea of where they all are. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody. This is airport based and population based, and North America isn't in here at all, because basically North America has gone a different route. Like the United States has kiosks. They have their global entry kiosks, and they're really pushing on automated passport control. And we'll look at that in a minute. So the gates has really been, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. So automated passport control kiosks, these are something, and they have a slightly different name in Canada. I think they call them automated, I think they're using ABC, automated border control. I don't know what the actual acronym is, but so this is really a North America phenomenon. Again, I expected this to spread more widely across regions. It hasn't, but the US and Canada have enthusiastically embraced these kiosks. And if you've traveled in the US recently, you've seen them. Instead of waiting in line to go to the border control agent, you enter all your data in a kiosk, and then you go talk to a border control agent, but they've already got your data. Now, interestingly enough, the last time I did this, I flew through Phoenix coming from Mexico, and there were so many Americans using the automated passport control kiosk. It was actually a longer line than than going through the straight line to go see the border control agent. So that was not good. So we've got some work to do to figure out how to make these things work effectively to move people through spaces, as this automation grows.
I use it coming into Toronto, and it's fantastic. It's just so fast and easy, and it's Iris here.
Yeah. And one more, this is obviously not the government space per se, but I just wanted to give you guys an idea of where these mobile smart devices are going in terms of installed base. And when I first started putting out these numbers, again, people kind of told me I was nuts. And these numbers reflect smartphones, tablets, and wearables. The number for 2017 for smartphones alone is like 1.9 billion. I keep seeing numbers that are so much lower than this. I don't think people really understand how widespread biometrics has become. And as I said, a lot of these are not highly reliable biometrics, but to me, that's not the point. The point is we now have a global platform, and we have global adoption and acceptance. And 10 years ago, I think it would have been pretty hard for most people in the industry to fathom we were going to have a global platform of 2 billion devices in 2017. So I'm going to hand it back to Peter. Let me just close with this. There's tons of data, as I said, on my website. This is where I play, is in the data realm. There's obviously I sell this and sell reports, but there's also quite a bit of data that's available for download. And so please visit the site, and you can follow me on Twitter. I like to throw controversy out into the world sometimes, and so we get some good discussions going. So and with that, I will turn it back to Peter.
Max, thank you so much. Always find your research so interesting and informative. Now I'd like to introduce our two other panelists joining us today from Crossmatch, Jim Albers, Vice President of Government Sales, and from NEC Corporation of America, Benji Hutchinson, Senior Director of Washington D.C. Operations. Welcome. And given the recent Equifax breach, I thought we'd kick off our conversation today with some cybersecurity questions. As biometrics are becoming more prominent and government cybersecurity is becoming a critical area of focus, new regulations are being put into place governing the use of biometrics and identity management technology. What are the most pressing government regulations now that affect the biometric industries, and what opportunities are the opening for identity management? And Jim, could I ask you please to start off with this one?
Thank you, Peter. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me today. I really appreciate it. And I want to say congratulations on 16 years in the business. It's a tremendous accomplishment for you.
Well, thanks so much.
So when I look at your question here, I think about kind of two areas that really affect, I believe, most of the people that are on this call, most of the attendees of this webinar. The first one being regulations that affect us as government contractors. And then there are regulations that affect potentially our customers, right? The people that we sell to, the systems integrators, and the states and the government in general. So in the first category, Maxine already referred to it, not by name, but the DFARS regulations that specify the contractors are obligated to implement information protection requirements on all covered contractor information systems. And then on the other side, there's the GDPR stuff, right? General data protection regulations And you're seeing these things proliferate not only in the federal governments and the international governments, but the state governments. Illinois and Texas have both implemented GDPR type regulations, and they're gonna impact the offerings that we make and the offerings that our commercial and government contractors have out there. In terms of opportunities, obviously, there's always, I'm an optimist, as Benji knows. I always see opportunity in chaos. So when things emerge like this, industry reacts and creates opportunities and creates solutions for these regulations. In the first area that Maxine mentioned, multi-factor integration, composite authentication is out there for government contractors to put into their IT systems so that they meet the DFARS regulations. As far as the other industries are concerned, we're seeing, I think, some reaction and overreaction to the breaches that Maxine talked about, and not only the Equifax, but the HBO, Target, Home Depot in the last few years. And the protection of PII for those industries is going to be critical, and again, offers opportunities for not only biometrics, but also for identity management technologies.
Thank you very much, Jim. Benji, can I get your take on this one, please?
Absolutely. And again, thanks for having me, Peter. It's great to be here with everybody. Yeah, just to piggyback on what Jim said, he's absolutely right. You're seeing a lot of these laws come out across the country in the form of Biometric Information Privacy Acts. And, they're called BIPAs for shorthand. I think that is something that we see coming out to manage sort of how do you protect the PII, or the personal identifiable information that's collected and in use by some of these systems. So there's a bunch of states that are taking a look at this. You've got states, Alaska, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. And I think you're going to have to see a lot more of this happen. And it will cause some challenges, but I do agree with Jim. He said he's an optimist, and that is true. As these systems become more widely deployed, I think the laws will have to catch up with them in ways to protect the systems and the data that are ingested by the systems. So where, traditionally governments lag behind with policy in most cases, it takes them a while to catch up, and the technology is a little bit more quick to adopt and to be widely deployed. But governments are catching on. They're paying attention. They know that we live in a digital world, and they're doing things to kind of make that happen. And that's at the state level. I think at the federal level, you do see some efforts to combat this. There's been discussions on Capitol Hill about the comprehensive cyber legislation for a long time in the U.S. It has not passed. The same thing for privacy. There's been a number of privacy discussions, albeit not new legislation, but that is starting to ramp up, and you've seen that in a number of congressional testimonies over the past year. And I think you'll probably see more of that going forward as these systems become more widely deployed. And in the opening discussions from Max, and from you, Peter, we heard about the Apple iPhone and 3D facial recognition. Senator Franken was the first to stand up and sort of send a letter and say, hey, we've got concerns. We need to discuss this further. So I think it's just the beginning. When you start to see more of this technology out there, there's going to be more dialogue and more discussion about how to properly regulate it.
Thank you very much. And Max, do you have anything you'd like to add to that one?
Yes. Well, what I'd like to say is that I think it's critically important that, as we're talking about security and we're talking about privacy, that the industry invests in education, because I think people look at biometrics and say, oh no, it's more PII and I'm exposing myself more and it's really scary, and now we can't trust Equifax. And I think we need to really clarify a couple things. One is that biometrics can be a solution to this problem, not an add-on. That if we use biometrics to control access to that information, and we do it in a way that is not just incorporates privacy by design, but security by design. In other words, we purpose build systems to store and manage our biometric data, and we use those systems to provide locks and keys to our PII that's stored in other places. that biometrics can actually help solve this problem. And I think this is something that we really have to do as an industry. We have to say, look, you don't store biometric templates with other PII. It should never be together in the same place. You shouldn't have access to PII unless you can be biometrically verified, right? We don't want to rely on databases that are designed to facilitate data mining, to make it easy to extract information to secure our data. We should be using purpose-built solutions that are designed for security to secure our data. And so I think the onus is really on the industry to stand up and to say, look, you know, this biometrics is a solution. Biometrics is not gonna contribute to this problem. And the other thing I think we also have to do, and this is like, I just put out a paper on biometrics, server-side biometrics, cloud biometrics, and I talk about this extensively in the paper, which is biometrics are not a secret, right? If you can't steal somebody's biometrics. The idea that someone's going to steal your biometric and then, oh, you're going to steal your finger and then fingerprint and you're never going to be able to use it again for a biometric is just false. And we all know that because we're storing templates, and templates are based on algorithms, and templates can be revoked and algorithms can be changed. So I think, you know, we really need to frame the conversation about how biometrics is a tool that can actually help us solve these problems. It's not just a pile-on.
Thank you very much, Max. You know, it's very interesting in a lot of the live conferences where we're having panels, et cetera. A lot of those questions do come up, and it is something that the industry and it really needs to address. Next question. Governments are deploying biometrics for everything from voting to civil ID to public safety to time and attendance. Where are you seeing the most demand from government clients, and why are they choosing biometrics? Benji, could I ask you to start off on this one, please?
Absolutely. So after a while of biometrics sort of being quiet in the government space over the past several years, in a lot of ways, there wasn't as much investment as there was in the late 2000s after 9/11. But over the past 2 to 4 years, what we're starting to see is a lot of focus on use cases for immigration and homeland defense and security. So, and it harkens back to what Max was saying about how the technology has matured, and how I do like her phrase, the do nothing biometrics, because it's absolutely true. So, you know, the technology has been evolving. We all know that. And for the first time in our industry, we can see that the performance and the accuracy of the technology is at a certain level, whether it's the mathematics, the algorithm behind the software, or it's the sensor of the hardware. The technology doesn't require a lot of human interaction like it once did. So for example, if you're talking about facial recognition or iris, you can just simply walk by it. You don't have to stop and stare and interact with the machinery. It just works. And that is a real victory. But we are seeing a lot of the government, government users really start to latch on to this development in the industry, and specifically Department of Homeland Security. It's been a real sea change. They've very much woken up, whether it's Customs and Border Protection or ICE. A lot of these different agencies have really started to latch on to the use of this technology over the past 1 or 2 years. And I think that what's going to happen is you're going to see these trends continue in just adjacent markets, such as airports, the aviation space, entertainment hubs, where you've got large stadiums, but also in large pedestrian areas where people congregate. You're going to start to see this technology be deployed to provide a higher level of safety and security, but also for customer satisfaction or passenger facilitation if you're going through a transportation hub. Because again, it just works for the first time, and it's going to be more widely adopted and used and accepted.
Thanks, Benji. Jim, where are you seeing the most demand, and why are biometrics being chosen?
So I want to, just talk about some of the things that Maxine and Benji have talked about, and clearly we're seeing most of the demand, particularly on these two areas in immigration and border control. And I want to go to your second question. What are they demanding? And I see now that biometrics is becoming accepted, that it's becoming accepted in the consumer world. It makes it easier for governments and politicians to accept biometrics as a solution. So you'll see the federal agencies, the executive branch, adopting more and more biometrics and identity plays as we go forward. The demand that I see in the industry, and I think it's very good to the industry, and which is a very good trend, is interoperability and the ability to have very light touch to identify people as they come through airports, for example. The government is demanding no more proprietary software. Years ago, Peter and I, when we were first in the business, everybody had their own stuff. Everybody had their own algorithm. Everybody had their own hardware. They all worked. They didn't work together. Now you see, and back to FIDO, which was the first thing we talked about, you see systems that will work together, that are interoperable. And the government is finally learning that they need to be able to exchange information. You know, Benji mentioned two within DHS. I'd like to see all of them, including TSA, working with CBP and working with ICE and the Coast Guard to make sure that the identity flow comes across the border and is tracked. You know, more and more, we're seeing the larger databases like the State Department databases come into play, which is something we've been talking about for quite some time, which would really facilitate the knowledge of people coming in and going out of our country.
Well, that's very interesting. You raised some quite a few interesting points there. One is, you know, it used to be the government driving the industry, and then consumer would follow along. But it seems now like the consumer part of the industry is driving, especially with mobility, and government is scrambling to catch up. And also, I do remember 10 years ago when we do our year in review and ask what are the important issues, standards and interoperability for years were what everybody was focused on. So thank goodness we're past all that and moving forward rapidly.
Just one more point on that, Peter, is, you know, let's not forget that, well, Benji and my success early on, and maybe many of the people that are listening to this, started with catching bad guys. So, you know, when you're catching bad guys, the rules are different. And I think the consumer part of this is now brought it to the good guys, right? So how does it make my life easier? How is my travel facilitated? How do I get through airports very quickly? That's what people are thinking about, particularly, you know, my kids. You know, they don't want to deal with the things that we used to have to deal with. So I think it did originally start with bad guys catching bad guys, and it's gone on from there, and now it's going to make people's lives easier.
Wonderful.
And safer.
Now on to the next question. Year after year, governments are increasingly turning to biometrics for border control solutions for reasons of national security, customs, and immigration. Within this sector, what solutions are receiving the greatest demand, and how do you expect that to change over the next 5 years? And Max, can I ask you to start on this one, please?
Yes, I'm happy to. As I said earlier, you know, really what we're moving towards in the airport environment and in other choke point environments, we get to other ports and other security locations, is this kind of do nothing biometric approach, which is ultimately what we want to do. Is we want to have a way to link people to their credential. And right now those credentials are still physical credentials, but eventually they're going to be digital credentials. So you make sure the person that is going to be moving through this space is the correct person. They are linked to a valid credential that allows them to make that journey, and that essentially you move through that journey without being stopped. You know, that you can go through that process effortlessly and securely. I mean, this is when we talk about facilitation in and security. In the mobile world, we talk about friction, the opposite, and security. But you know, when we're starting to see these things happen, this is no longer just a pipe dream. And I think it goes to this idea of interoperability. It goes to the idea of people now carrying around authentication, personal authentication devices on their body. And it goes to moving from this, you know, notion where we have to control the process, where we feel like we need to be engaged in that process, to a place where we feel comfortable enough as citizens and as consumers to allow the authentication to be happening without direct engagement. And so you have to balance this need for movement through a facility with an appropriate level of feedback. And I think we're going to have to figure out what that is over the next few years. You know, how much feedback is too much and how much feedback isn't enough. And how do you integrate that with larger border control issues? You know, we're seeing, you know, a move towards closing borders, like for example in the EU, as opposed to open borders because of issues around migration and immigration and terrorism. And so to me, it's really a question of, you know, what does that future look like? How do we construct that from a user experience standpoint? And how do we build the back end systems that support that happening? And at the same time, how are we protecting the data? How are we handling privacy? What's happening with this information? How is it being used? It's being shared. What are the constraints around how that information can be used and shared? So these are pretty large problems to solve, but really, if you think about where we're going on the border, I think there's pretty universal consensus that we have to somehow leverage this technology to continue to create this seamless experience, and at the same time make sure we're managing these other concerns that, you know, on the citizen side for privacy and data protection, and on the government side for, you know, basically having control and understanding of who's moving through the borders that we do have.
Thank you very much, Max. And Jim, can I get your take on this question, please?
Yeah, I think the border is an interesting area. I certainly think the answer to the last question is what's changing. I think face recognition is taking over there. I know that a number of pilots are going on right now, and the databases, obviously, as I mentioned, State Department are there for the government to use. But I kind of want to go back to something that both Maxine and Benji referred to. You know, 5 years ago, we testified before Senator Franken's committee, and there was a lot of talk about security versus privacy and the trade-off between the two. And I think Maxine really hit on it when she said we have to acknowledge and we have to get out there the fact that biometrics enhances privacy. It's not a trade-off. And as we move forward, and I think the travel industry is going to lead the way. Trusted travelers will be able to walk through the airport without bringing on a credential at all. And that I think is going to be the first step that people start to realize that, hey, you know, I'm a trusted traveler. Maybe I don't even have to put my bag on the conveyor belt. You know, TSA is looking at very interesting ways of actually defining the receiver operating characteristics for everybody that travels through, and will be able to turn up and down the dials for those devices that are there based on your trusted status. So it's very interesting that not only biometrics but other screening, you know, chemical, radiological, nuclear detection devices will be tuned according to your trusted traveler status. And I think biometrics is leading the way. And again, as Maxine mentioned, the credential piece going digital. I think your identity will be digital at some point in time. And on the other side, I believe that individuals will be able to own their own personal rock curve, if you will, to be able to turn up the dial when they have communications, when they have commerce, when they have transactions with other individuals. They'll be able to ask for more multi-factor authentication dealing with people over the internet.
Well, I really like that thought. And Benji, can I get your take on this question, please?
Sure, absolutely. You know, we've been talking a lot about how facial recognition is coming to the iPhone and what that means for privacy. Look, I agree with what we've discussed. You know, it is a giant step towards bringing the security of biometrics to tens of millions of people. This is going to be a mass adoption and an acceptance of the technology. And it's a victory for personal security and privacy. And once people become a lot more comfortable with using this technology, you're going to see it take off. And the future is absolutely frictionless, it's paperless, and it's freedom of movement. You're going to see people from reservation to destination walking through spaces, whether it's an airport or a train station or whatever it might be, even an entertainment hub. That is the future, and they're going to be interacting with these sensors and not even know it. You know, you're going to have opt-in options where people are going to want that higher level of convenience. And the next generation of folks, you know, Jim mentioned his kids. I totally agree. They're not as concerned. They want the trade-offs. They want to have a higher level of facilitation, a higher level of really ease of use. So the future looks bright when it comes to using this different types of technology.
Well, thank you. And I just want to let our attendees know that we're going to extend this a little bit longer because we're getting a lot of questions in from our attendees, and a lot have to do with this conversation we're having currently about privacy and responsibility, et cetera. So just, to sort of paraphrase, what responsibility does the biometric industry or vendors have to participate in the privacy and government biometric conversation? And Benji, maybe you could just continue along on that thought. What should we be doing? What is the responsibility here?
So we've talked about a couple of things, one of them being education, letting everybody know that, again, this is a victory. The adoption of biometrics is a victory for privacy and security. Max is totally correct. We shouldn't be focusing so much on the negativity of it. This is a very positive fact that we're starting to see biometrics be more widely adopted. And it will provide a higher level of security for our data. So education is the first thing. And the second thing is when you get down to the engineering principles, privacy by design is something that we take very seriously. We also spend a lot of time looking at ways to make our algorithms, for NECs in particular, looking for ways to make our algorithms more robust. And we absolutely spend millions of dollars and hours, countless hours, training these algorithms with highly diverse data sets. And we look for ways to decrease the error rates as close to zero as possible. And that's not achievable, but we get as close to it as we can. So a lot of the concerns that swirl around privacy, I think they're not necessarily completely well understood. And I think that we have a responsibility in the industry to educate folks and let them know how we build this technology, and that we do have a vested interest in ensuring that people's data is protected and that the technology works as well as we can possibly make it work.
Great, and I'm going to move on now because I want to try and get to as many questions as possible. Here's the next one. What is your view on FIDO impact in government authentication case? You don't know, for those of you in the audience who don't know FIDO, it's fast identity online. Will there also be need for server-side biometrics? And maybe Jim, could you start on this one for us?
Yeah, I think FIDO is a tremendous forum for us to have those discussions, and it's been, as far as I'm concerned, very positive and visionary organization and outlook for where the industry needs to go, much broader than just biometrics, but identity, across the board.
Great, and Max, will server-side stuff have their role? I mean, this is always a conversation at the panel discussions we have at conferences, and it seems to be both are developing. What's your view there?
Okay, so I'm going to do a shameless self-promotion here. If you're interested in details of this discussion, please go to the Acuity website. I just published a white paper called Taming the Authentication Beast. And it basically is about simplifying the customer journey through the use of cloud-based biometrics. So here's my thoughts. Linking our biometrics to our devices, to our smartphones, which have essentially become our personal authentication devices, is critically important. On-device authentication is critically important. FIDO's mission as an organization is to get rid of passwords. I think we can all jump up and down and applaud that. On-device authentication, really important. However, in order to actually uniquely verify the identity of an individual, we have to do that on the server side. Because if you simply link a person to their device, and then you say, okay, now my smartphone says I'm Maxine Most. If I move beyond the boundary of that smartphone, I'm now reducing all of the rich biometric data, probabilistic data, to a simple yes or no. It's me or it's not me, accept or reject. That doesn't give you a lot of reliability beyond the device. So to me, it's a combination of both. And FIDO has done an amazing job promoting biometrics, building the acceptability of biometrics, creating demand for biometrics. And now I think the onus is on the industry to say, great, so we have device-based authentication. Now we need to understand how that needs to exist in a broader ecosystem where we manage device versus server side. If I'm going to go buy a train ticket, I just found out I can use I'm so excited. I'm going to London, and I don't need to worry about buying tube tickets because I can use my Apple Pay on my smartphone. If I'm going to go buy a 6-pound tube ticket in London, I don't really think I need to do server-side biometrics. Probably authenticating myself to my device is fine. However, if I'm going to my bank account, I'm going to go transfer $10,000 to somebody, device authentication is not enough. So we have to think about the ecosystem that we're operating in. We have to look at risk assessment, and we need to understand how these two different methods of authenticating ourselves are going to fit together in a broader solution.
Okay, thank you. And just one final question here. To what extent will mobile systems used in government conform to NDF PPV 3.1? Does anybody know of existing government systems that are conforming to this? Does anybody have an answer for that one?
I can't Google it that fast, Peter.
Yeah, so actually, so the Rod who asked that question, I'll get back to you on that. I'll give you an answer. And unfortunately, that's our time for today. Thank you all for participating. It's been quite a discussion today. I've really enjoyed it. And again, I want to thank our sponsors, NEC Corporation of America and Crossmatch, for their continued support, and especially to Maxine Mokes from Acuity Market Intelligence for her updates today. Thank you very much. That ends our webinar today.